G'day, welcome to the Financial Bloke Podcast, the podcast for people seeking the wisdom needed to grow their family's wealth and live a happier, healthier and more prosperous life. My name's Ben Law and I am the Financial Bloke. All levels of government have been living well beyond their means for a long time now. They've been racking up historically unprecedented levels of debt on our behalf. I mean, we're up to about $1 trillion in debt now, and that's excluding what the states owe. Now, I believe racking up debt now, which our kids and grandkids will need to pay back, is a form of intergenerational theft, which is something I think as a society we should be ashamed of. Now, it's a complex problem, and I'm not stupid or naive enough to think there's a simple fix. What I can say that for the practical minded of us, the overriding principle should be for Australia to live within its means. And what I mean by that is to spend less than we earn and simply invest or save the balance, which does seem kind of simple, doesn't it? Whilst there hasn't been the political will to address this problem to date, there will come a time when our leaders will be forced to find solutions. It's unlikely they'll have the political will or intestinal fortitude to lower spending, so that really only leaves one main option, which is to increase Australia's income, and that, my friends, means increasing taxes. History tells me that increased taxes almost always seems to disproportionately fall on everyday folks just like us, so we need to take notice, particularly because the global push is towards a decrease in business or company taxes. Other countries are lowering company or corporate tax rates to remain competitive and attract foreign investment, and Australia is under pressure to do the exact same thing if it wants to remain competitive. That leaves everyday Australians in the tax hike firing line. We've all heard lazy and weak-minded politicians suggesting the solution is to just tax the rich, which on the surface seems kind of okay, doesn't it? But what I want farmers and graziers and any business owners listening to understand is that you're the rich they're talking about. That's because you own land and there's money in land, easy taxing money. And that brings me to our topic today, death taxes. For anyone that was in farming back in, say, the 60s or the 70s, this should send a chill up your spine. You'll probably remember something called inheritance tax, which caused many farming families to have to sell up and lose the farm when mum or dad died because they couldn't afford the death taxes. When it comes to the concept of inheritance taxes, I want to know more, as I've heard politicians and media commentators raising the idea of death taxes more frequently than ever before. Now, we're all going to die at some stage, and whether it's our parents leaving assets to us or us leaving assets to our kids, the legislation of death taxes or inheritance taxes will impact your family. So this is a podcast you won't want to miss. Today's guest is someone I've had on the podcast a few times now, my mate Tim Rivett. Tim's a lawyer and has a very strong tax knowledge, and he and I are going to discuss the history of death taxes, what they look like in other countries, and if implemented in Australia, how they could impact your family's wealth. I'm excited to get going, so welcome, Tim.
Thanks, Ben. Great to be here.
Fantastic. Okay, Tim, let's start with something really simple. What the hell is a death tax and why should we be worried about them?
So, Ben, just go back one step. 3 types of death taxes in my very simple view. We have our income tax, and we have our spendings tax, and we have wealth tax. Income tax we're all very, very used to. We all have employment or have income sources. The government chisels off a bit of money and says, thank you, that's your income tax. Transactional or spendings tax we've had now as the GST in Australia for 20 years. And the more complicated one that people may not understand is the concept of asset or wealth tax. Okay, so in short, taxing assets that you have created or built either during your generation or that have been passed on through different generations. And the government says, I'd really like to take a percentage of that or a couple of bucks from you just because you've died. And there's a long, long history, not only in Australia, but other parts of the world where death taxes have either come and gone or are still around.
Because I think, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realise that we're going through a point in history now where government debt has ballooned massively and they're looking for ways to raise revenue because it's politically unpopular to lower spending and raise taxes. And I think this is something that's starting to be talked about in the media more and more often. So do we have a history of death taxes here in Australia?
Yeah, we do, Ben. So pre-Federation, so pre-1901, each colony, what we now know as states, had their own form of a death tax. Now, we inherited that from our British predecessors, part of colonial law that came to Australia. And each of the nations around that, or each of the colonies as it was back in the day, 1901 came along, federation. The federal government actually left death taxes to the states. So the states made no changes on any of their arrangements for about almost 15 years. Along came World War I, Ben, and the game changed. Australia, as a federation's first major war, the government said, we need some money, so we're going to bring in a federal death tax just to fund World War I. Now, World War I, terrible, terrible thing, came and went. The government just maintained that tax, Ben, because they got very, very used to the revenue that was associated with that. So for a very long period of time, Australia actually had a federal death tax as well as a state-by-state and territory death tax. So it's sort of a double whammy, and it was really, really unfair. There were always grumbles from people who were affected by it, but because the government was so reliant on the death tax, they really couldn't get rid of it because they needed to replace that revenue from somewhere else. So fast forward, I suppose, to the Joh Bjelke-Petersen days. So there's a truth to the fact that Sir Joh got rid of death taxes in Australia. Obviously, he was a state-based politician in the 70s in Queensland. So what he did in 1977 was he decided to abolish the Queensland-based death taxes. And Queensland was the first state or territory in Australia to do so. What then happened, reportedly, was that every retiree in Australia moved to the Gold Coast, Ben, not only because it's a beautiful climate and why wouldn't you retire to Queensland, but there were no death taxes. So what that did was it put pressure on all the other states and territories to follow suit, and that happened over a period of, say, 5 years. And then by about 1982-83, all of the state-based death taxes were gone, and the federal government was under so much pressure that it actually abolished death taxes. Okay, and 3 years later, we had what's called capital gains tax, which I cynically believe is because the federal government was under pressure to get rid of their estate tax, realised they needed the revenue, and then replaced it with a capital gains tax.
And governments like to do that. They like to put them in by stealth, don't they?
Definitely, Ben.
That's what I've seen. And in America, you mentioned before how everyone moved to the Gold Coast because there was no death taxes in Queensland and it caused a move in population. The same thing's happening in America at the moment. I mean, I look at the population runoff, I think it is in California to places like Florida, where Florida doesn't have income tax, I think it is, or Texas. And people are starting to move money around and move where they live around to deal with those personal taxes. And I think here in Australia, these sorts of things would end up being a federal tax rather than a state tax. I mean,
during the pandemic, we saw how parochial each state has been. You know, we are a federation of states, and that's never been so obvious as during the pandemic when each of our premiers sort of ran their own show, if you like. But I do believe that if a death tax is on the horizon, it probably needs to be at a federal level, for the same reason as what we are seeing in the US and what Sir Joh did. You know, it would be very difficult for one state to bring it in because they're all competing for not only business but retirees and people who have the luxury of choosing where they live. So, yeah, my personal view is if we get it, it won't be called a death tax. It'll be called something different, something obscure, like a budget repair levy or something along these lines. The government love those types of things. Maybe it'll be a pandemic repair levy, something along those lines. But, yeah, it'll be in by stealth and it'll be thrown in with a bunch of other legislation to try to minimise the media impact so people don't know that it's coming.
Yeah. And we do have a sort of death tax in some ways at the moment, don't we? I mean, you mentioned there before capital gains tax. And you also, I think the other one I always look at is some money that's in superannuation that gets handed to non-tax dependents is taxed in a certain way. I mean, obviously it's not significant, but it is a sort of a death tax in some way, shape or form.
Yeah. So, Ben, in our practice, we always call them de facto death taxes. So they're by another name, but they operate exactly the same. So capital gains tax is in effect a death tax, which is why I say that the federal government back in the mid-80s got rid of death taxes and then replaced it with the capital gains tax regime. Now, it's a better tax for the federal government because they don't have to wait until you die. They just have to wait until you transfer or gift something or sell it. And then, depending on your eligibility and the rules, they put their hand out there and then. So capital gains tax definitely operates as a de facto death tax, particularly because there's a few little known things like the taxation treatment of foreign beneficiaries. So we see this a lot, Ben. We see educated next generation go overseas. Maybe they do the London thing. Maybe they have a gap year somewhere else. They fall in love, meet a partner, get a job, and decide that, hey, this is a great lifestyle to lead for 5 to 10 years, not just for the 12 months that you told mum and dad you were going to go for. And suddenly you've got an expat son or daughter living overseas. Sounds great, except from an estate planning point of view, the capital gains tax treatment for a foreign beneficiary, as in not an Australian taxpayer at the time of your death, is extremely harsh. Depending on the type of property that you're considering giving to them, it can actually operate as if you've sold those and creates a death tax. So we unfortunately see where poor planning is done, assets have to be sold just to pay the tax, just because a beneficiary has based themselves overseas, which seems pretty harsh.
Today's episode is brought to you by AgriCoach. You've worked bloody hard over the years and you've built a solid operation. But as your children grow up and start their own journeys, you're beginning to think about the next 5, 10, and even 15 years and how to keep driving the business forward and ensure a smooth and successful succession plan. Preparing the business, preparing the next generation, and preparing for your eventual retirement all requires a solid plan and a proven process. Unsure about the right steps to take? Head on over to agricoach.com.au/webinar to learn more about our Succession Proof Your Family webinar. AgriCoach, aligning families, growing wealth, and protecting legacies. And now, let's get back to the episode. And it's interesting. I've heard it come up in the media more and more often these days, and politicians are sort of, how do we put it, are suggesting death taxes or testing the water, I suppose, in the media. And I never really took any notice of it because I didn't really early on understand the concept of a death tax and why it would be important. Not necessarily I didn't understand. I probably just didn't give it too much thought. And I remember the day that changed was when I spoke to someone a few years back, and their family had lost their farm, I think back in the 60s, or it might have been the early 70s, where they had a property up in far north Queensland, been in the family for a number of generations. Dad died. They were in the middle of a drought. They'd sold off a whole heap of sheep. And then all of a sudden the death duties or the probate duties came in, I think they called them, and they ended up having to sell the farm because they couldn't fund those death duties. And it all of a sudden, I suppose, dawned on me then as saying, okay, well, if death taxes come in, the people that are going to be hit by these things very hardly will be the farmers, graziers, and also business owners that own assets. And it'll disproportionately. Now, I'm guessing the politicians will be smart enough to maybe put some concessions in there, but still it's a risk that they may happen because you don't want to get to the stage of, succession planning your farming assets and then find out, oh no, they've all got to be sold because we've got to pay the death taxes.
That's right. And, like we talked about, Ben, they won't necessarily be called death tax anymore, but they will operate in the same manner. And the United Kingdom has had a long history of probate taxes or death taxes or estate taxes, whatever you want to call them. And the wealth of family grazing and farming families has been decimated because you tend to be very, very asset rich or quite asset rich, but cash poor. Your cash is your livestock. That's your cash flow in a rural enterprise. So to have to come up with a large unplanned for sum of money, because none of us know when our time comes, particularly when somebody passes away through tragedy or just well before their time, it can be a really huge impact. And unfortunately, there is a long history of properties having to be sold and farms having to be broken up in particularly that British and English jurisdiction.
And so death taxes are around the world, Tim, because again, that's not my strong point. There must be some advanced countries around the world that actually have death taxes. What do those look like?
Yeah, so Australia was actually a pioneer in abolishing death taxes. Like I said, we inherited it from the colonial laws, but there are lots of other countries in the world that don't derive from colonial law where death taxes still operate today. So let's talk about OECD countries, as in developed nations, there are still 24 countries in the world that actually have working and operational death taxes. So some big examples in Europe, France is the biggest and harshest. There's often considerable issues associated that you would have seen back in the day in Britain. In Asia, you've got South Korea and Japan. Even the US has a death tax, Ben. It's not called that, and it's not really a highly politicized issue because it's a very high threshold death tax. So we're talking in the US about estates worth 10 or 11 million US before you're into death tax territory. So it really is a tax on the wealthy. In Belgium, for example, the threshold is very, very low. So statistically, you're seeing more than 50% of every estate, every person who dies will pay some sort of death tax. It's a scale-based, percentage-based issue. But a lot of the devil is in the detail in those jurisdictions. So the thresholds seem to be the key. And I think that'll be the big debate in Australia if and when the debate happens. Maybe it won't. Maybe it'll slip in the middle of the night. But I think the concept of the thresholds will be the important. When does it kick in and what sort of percentages are we talking about here?
Yeah, and I think the danger is, Tim, the obvious one, which is, let's say they put in a death tax at $10 million. That still means there's a lot of farming assets out there that are possibly worth more than $10 or $11 million. And that would capture a lot of the rural community, and that's going to put significant strain on families that are trying to build wealth into the farming business and get scale, etc.
Yeah, particularly because Australia has had a really good run for 20 or 25 years, and there have been lots and lots of families who've worked extremely hard and sacrificed so much to build that. And, unfortunately, from a government point of view, they look at that as a big pool of assets that they can try and get their hands on. And there is a nervousness and an anxiety around that. Ben, we are doing estate planning and succession planning now because the matriarch or patriarch remembers the 70s, remembers the death tax era, and maybe there's some family history there with, grandparents or great-grandparents having some, some implications of that. There's so much anxiety that they will bring it in that we're actually handing over considerable assets, i.e. grazing and farming properties, to the next generation because of an anxiety from those older generations.
Thinking about it.
And the anxiety for a lot of people, Ben, is if a new tax is brought in, it might be called something different, but the government has the power to make that retrospective. So, lots of these taxes may come in and say, well, we're going to go back 5 years or even 10 years in some cases and say if anyone has gifted it over, we need to look at that transaction and put our hand out. So, there are families out there who are saying, let's do it now so that if or when it comes in, we're long enough ago that we're avoiding that, that retrospective nature of a new tax.
And I think from my point of view, Tim, I strongly believe that spending well outside our means as a country, I read the other day we've got over $1 trillion in debt now, and that's just the federal government. That's not the state governments. So that's $1 trillion someone's going to have to pay back. So I believe reducing expenditure and increasing taxes is what we have to do. We have to live within our means. What I always get concerned about these things is politicians end up taking the least painful route or the most popular route. And sometimes that can be going after the easy money, which is in the form of estates or large farming assets. And it could be very easy to sell to the public, this is in the best interest of everyone, when it's not necessarily. And, you've heard them saying, we've got to tax the rich, tax the rich. They're the ones that are getting away and not paying their fair share. And I think it's the old law of unintended consequences. They put these taxes in place. Invariably what happens is it seems to fall on everyday people, not the, in inverted commas, rich. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, definitely. And I think the point we want to make for a lot of people listening is that you are the rich that they're talking about. I know that's not a word that most of our friends and client bases would use to describe themselves, Ben, but, on a balance sheet asset test, according to a politician, you are exactly who they are talking about when they say we're going to bring in a threshold-based death tax. So that's, I guess, why we're trying to have this conversation and make sure that people are forewarned is forearmed, as they say, because historically we see these taxes coming in as a direct result of some external stimulus. So funding a war. A pandemic would be a good one. A natural disaster. Unfortunately for Australia and the world at the moment, there are all three of these things going on, Ben. We have a complicated conflict in Russia and Ukraine. Australia has had a terrible time with natural disasters recently, and that's going to come with a considerable cleanup bill and a real shortfall, we're assuming, in insurance. And, geopolitically, we're hoping that we can avoid conflict, but we don't know what the future holds for Australia in terms of Asia Pacific. So I suppose we've got to go back and remember why these taxes get brought in the first place. Think about what's going on in terms of external stimulus in Australia and in the rest of the world, and just understanding what might come about so that we don't all get hoodwinked by this temporary tax, which ends up being around for hundreds of years. And I've got a little analogy to use, Ben, and this is just because I'm a tax nerd, not because other people will find it interesting, but we can always cut this out of the podcast later. You've got to think about the history of stamp duty. So why do I mention stamp duty? It's not capital gains tax. You pay stamp duty when you buy stuff. Basically, it's a buyer's tax. So stamp duty was introduced in 1694 in Britain under the reign of William III and Mary II to fund a war against France, right? Britain and France loved a scrap. So that war, if you like, went on for a couple of hundred years, all through the Napoleonic Wars of the 1800s. And the first recorded stats from that stamp duty in the early 1700s were 4 million stamps in a 12-month period, generating £91,000. Now, in today's money, that doesn't sound like a lot, but we're talking about tens, possibly hundreds of billions of dollars in today's money in the 1700s. So fast forward, the wars, I guess you'd say, ended, but stamp duty never ended. Colonialised countries went and imposed stamp duty on all of the colonies, including Australia. And interestingly, the American War of Independence, one of the sparks, if you like, the catalyst for that conflict, was the enforcement of the stamping that was going on in the US, because all that stamp duty money was going back to Mother Britain, and the Americans didn't like that. So we always call stamp duty the mañana tax, Ben. Mañana meaning tomorrow, as in we'll get rid of it tomorrow. Particularly Australian states, who are the ones responsible for stamp duty, they've been talking about getting rid of stamp duty for a very long time. The British government has been talking about it now for over 300 years. So why am I talking about this? The tax was brought in as a direct consequence of an armed conflict. It was brought in for a justifiable reason to raise funds. They never got rid of it, and it stuck around for a long, long time. So once you get these taxes in, they are really, really difficult to get rid of.
They are. And also, too, what is it, the OECD, one of the economic associations around the world, is talking about they're wanting countries to start implementing death taxes to address inequality. So that's their argument. So, and I think the head of the OECD is an ex-Labor politician. Did I get that right? I think I read somewhere. And so we've got politicians from Australia that are actually involved in organisations internationally that are agreeing with this. So it's basically has, shall we say, there's pressure from external sources to be able to say this is the best way to tax your country to be able to lower the inequality of assets between people.
Yeah, definitely. And amongst the OECD, like I said earlier, we've got 24 developed nations who have effective death taxes. So we're not talking about something radical here. We're not talking about something novel. We're talking about looking at the way other countries do it and thinking, well, actually, that's a good policy, over a long-term basis. There was an interesting Productivity Commission report that came down in November last year. It didn't get a lot of press because we were in the thick of the pandemic, and that was right before the Omicron wave came. But the purpose of that report, or one of the purposes of that report, was really to report on what the effect of a death tax would be in developed countries, i.e. Australia. So there's an argument going on, Ben, that there's an inequality of wealth, and lots of people are looking at places like the US where there's an enormous inequality of wealth. India is another example. China's a little bit more complicated, but when you look at 95% of the wealth being owned or controlled by 5% of the population, it's an obvious inequality, So there was a myth, I suppose, or a hypothesis that a death tax would contribute towards a redistribution of equality based on a threshold. But the myth was busted under the report. And the key take home was that taxing lower and middle income households with a death duty was a really poor outcome to achieve that redistribution in terms of equality of wealth. So what does that lead us to say? Does that say that death taxes don't work in Australia? No, not necessarily, but it means you've got to get those thresholds right. So again, we bang on about thresholds, but the thresholds are just so critical because remember the point we made earlier that for those of you listening who think, well, that's okay, they're going to tax the rich. Remember, you are the rich. You are who they are talking about, and those thresholds will probably catch you if you've worked really hard and created wealth through land.
And I think we see it in America. One of the political parties over there, their slogan was tax the rich. And I think we'll see a stage in Australia as our debt level keeps climbing and things become tough and they have to make tough choices. I reckon there will be a party that'll come out and with their slogan will be something along the lines of tax the rich. And it will become very popular as people find it harder to deal with inflation, etc. And it's a really good cash grab at that stage to be able to look at where are the big levels of money, how can we sell this and what will be popular.
Yeah, and think about that other, not even an external stimulus. We were talking about geopolitical issues and wars and pandemics and things, Ben, but look what's happening internally in Australia and that old saying that America sneezes and the world catches a cold. The inflation that's going on in America, maybe it's transient, maybe it's not, but Australia is experiencing, not to the same level, but we are experiencing it, and all the forecasts are that it's going to get worse and stick around for a while. So you've got cost of living pressures, you've got marginalised lower and middle income families who aspire to that wealth, but because of those rising costs of living, they're just not able to get there. But interestingly, the Labor government ran on a platform of tax reform at the last election, in particular abolishing or unsweetening, if you like, some of the capital gains tax exemptions and taxing the superannuation environment. And arguably, it lost them the election. So, politically, it's a difficult thing to get through the door, but there's nothing to say that a sitting government who didn't run on that as a mandate on an election won't have to introduce that tax in an emergency manner, and again, I don't want to bang on about that, but the justification for these new taxes are already going on. So if there's an intensification of a conflict in Europe and Australia has to get involved, don't be surprised if there's a tax. They'll call it what they call it. And don't be surprised if it's actually operating like an estate tax.
So there's a monstrous amount of money in Australia in superannuation, plus people's principal place of residence. So you're seeing people that are owning houses that they're living in, and we've seen the explosion in the value of homes. And you've got people that might have a $500,000 house is now worth $1 million, or $1 million's now worth $2 million. And as they transition on and sell that house or gift it to their kids when they pass away, there's no tax on it at all. So you can just see this pot of gold of superannuation, potentially $1 trillion, possibly many, many hundreds of billions of dollars worth of principal places of residence or people's houses transitioning to the next generation. And then you see all this farming land or land being owned. It's just a monstrous amount of money that's going to be changing hands. And if you can take a clip of that, as they'd say, it would be a very easy sell and a very easy way to raise money if done incorrectly, wouldn't it?
It definitely would. And land in Australia, not only residential, but commercial, industrial, and in particular rural, has just been on an increased trajectory for 20 years. And the last 2 years has seen a very, very, very strange set of circumstances during a global pandemic for lots of different reasons, mainly driven by low interest rates. We've seen incredible growth in land prices. So yes, we're definitely going to see some closer scrutiny, I suppose, of asset values based on land, but definitely superannuation. So it's an interesting one that there is a de facto death tax already contained in the superannuation environment, which you briefly mentioned, Ben, but I just want to make a couple of points about that. So we're still having clients come to us, particularly in the self-managed super fund environment. Not only, it can be in the retail environment as well. People still aren't realising that if you have grown-up kids, what we call grown-up kids, they are non-taxation dependents for taxation and superannuation laws, right? So in summary, there's a few tests to have to jump through, but if your kids are 18, they no longer live with you and they earn their own money, they will be taxed on superannuation that you leave to them, and it'll be the whole taxable component of your superannuation balance. Now, most people don't know what a taxable component is, and that's where you've got to go off and get some advice. But it can be 15 to 17% of the taxable component of your superannuation balance. And lots of people have worked really hard and taken advantage of some very favourable superannuation laws and, salary sacrificed, rolled money into super, sold assets and done contributions. So because of the growth of superannuation, we're seeing some of those taxation triggers in the hundreds of thousands of dollars if you apply that 15 to 17% test. Now, there are ways to lower that, and there are smart planning ways to do that. But if you don't do that or leave it until it's too late, because some of these strategies can take years to implement, you've just got to cop the tax. And we're still finding clients come to us and saying, I read this article the other day, or I heard it on a podcast. I had no idea that my superannuation would be taxed. What can I do about it? And that's powerful education. At least that they're aware of it, and there are some things they can do about it.
And also capital gains tax was the other one you mentioned before. They can tweak superannuation. And I think superannuation is one of those really by stealth ones, because if you turned around and said, look, on death, we're going to change it from 15% to 20 or 30% or something like that, the beneficiaries won't be too worried about it at the time because they just won't think about it until the money comes in. But capital gains tax, they could tweak that really easily. So how do you think a change to CGT or capital gains tax would equate to a death tax?
Yeah, so similar story. The example I gave before about the foreign beneficiaries is a really good example because we haven't had that rule for that long. And that came in relative obscurity. Nobody thought too much about it and thought, okay, they're making Australia a slightly less desirable place to invest money because, we had some foreign assets that were being bought by state-controlled entities and those sorts of things. And the government got pretty cranky about people who owned property in Australia, were Australian citizens, but derived all of their income overseas and effectively paid no tax in Australia. So they tweaked the capital gains tax rules to say, well, if you dispose of certain assets in Australia while you're overseas, then we're going to penalise you in terms of a taxation. You're not going to enjoy the 50% discount stuff. You're not going to enjoy the principal place of residence stuff because you're not actually living there. You've just got a vacant home sitting in Australia. One of the consequences of that was the CGT on the foreign beneficiaries, which just got caught by the fact that if your mum or dad die and you happen to be living permanently overseas at the time, you can be penalised for that. So that's the way they'll do things, Ben. They'll change the rules for certain classes of beneficiaries. They'll use some means tests. They'll use some asset tests. They'll implement some thresholds, but they definitely won't call it anything that you or I walking down the street will understand operates like a death tax. But in form and effect, that's absolutely what it will do.
What's some other ways they might look to raise revenue other than something like a death tax?
Well, I think the transactional tax based on the GST rate, Ben, is a low-hanging fruit. There's been some debate for many years about increasing the GST from 10% to maybe a 12 or a 15%. And that's an important one to bear in mind because some people don't really appreciate that GST is what we call a mum and dad's tax, right? GST does not affect people in business. In business, you are the tax collectors, but you're not actually paying the GST. So if I provide services to you for $100, Ben, I have to charge you $110. I take that $10 and I give that to the government. That's the GST component. The government says, thanks very much. I get an input credit for any amount of GST that I pay on any services that I engage in business. So I'm net outcome, right? I'm no worse off. I'm no better off. I'm just a tax collector. But instead of you paying $100 for your services, you've paid $110. So you're worse off because you're a mum and dad consumer. So if the government looks at how am I going to repair my budget or get rid of my trillions of dollars in debt or, whatever the case may be, I think the increase in the GST is definitely on the agenda. It's a low-hanging fruit. The GST gets carved up between the states. Theoretically, it funds hospitals and does all sorts of very, very important and very, very good things. There's always scraps between the states about sizes. Is it based on population headcount? Is it based on economic need? There's a bit of horse trading that goes on in the background, but not a death tax as such, more a spending or transactional tax. But I definitely think a tweak to the GST percentage is going to be on the cards.
When I started in financial advice 20 years ago, the tax on super was essentially 15%.
Mm-hmm.
And then both when you were accumulating money, when you were still working, and when you retired and started drawing a pension. And then I think it was about 2004, 2005, they brought in a tax change there, and they said for money once you're in retirement and you start a pension is essentially tax-free. And now if you've got hundreds of billions of dollars moving into the tax-free environment, completely tax-free over the next 10 to 15 years, you can just see that's a really easy way for them just to turn a little tax on or change things there, which would generate substantial revenue. I think that's an absolute obvious area because it used to be taxed. They got rid of the tax in this area. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to think that they'd turn it back on at some stage.
Well, now it's actually taxed again, Ben. And again, this is a great example. This thing called the transfer balance cap. Okay, the government always comes out and calls things a confusing name so that it's hard for people to latch onto what that really means. So a few years ago, the government at the time brought in the concept of the transfer balance cap, which when it came in was a $1.6 million individual cap on how much you can have in super to enjoy the tax-free income associated with those assets. It's now been indexed because I think we're 3 years down the track, so it's 1.7 million. But again, that's a good side door avenue to come in and clip the ticket on that. With inflation rising as it is, they may not need to do too much because 1.7 million won't be worth 1.7 million for very long. Sounds like an incredible amount of money. We're talking about self-funded retirees, Ben, and remember the concept and the support that all governments have given to superannuation is so that you can self-fund and not go on the pension, which costs the government a lot of money to fund your retirement. So there's still a lot of support for the superannuation regime and the superannuation environment, but we have one of the sweetest superannuation environments in the world in terms of taxation benefits. You can cap income coming into a super fund at 15%, 15 cents in the dollar. And if you're smart about how you retire and when you retire and the income that you pull out, you can effectively have a tax-free retirement plus franking credits that come from your ASX listed portfolio and pay no tax and live a good lifestyle. So you're not contributing to the taxation of the day, but it's too big an asset pool and too tempting a clip for that to be left alone forever, is my view. They'll either tweak the transfer balance cap and lower that maybe from the 1.7 million or just stop increasing that, so stop indexing that. So in 5 years' time, it'll be worth the equivalent of, say, 1.4 or 1.5 million instead, which will be a de facto correction. But I really think that the superannuation environment is just so attractive for good reason, because the government wanted everyone to motivate and self-fund their retirement. But we've got a lot of debt, and I really think it's a low-hanging fruit to tweak that in the future.
Yeah. But I want to make sure people understand too is even if they do increase the tax on it in certain areas, it's still an incredibly attractive way to invest your money long term from a tax point of view. So it doesn't mean that it makes it unviable. It just means it's less beneficial to people.
Yeah, and that's probably a point to make about the taxation on superannuation upon death. I know it's perceived as a nasty thing or an underhanded thing, but that's only because it's little known about. The concept of taxing on the way out is to compensate the taxation system for giving you such a good ride on the way in. You know, if the average taxation rate is 30% on an individual and you've salary sacrificed and put money into super at 15%, you're 15% better off. And the magic of compound interest, you know, the eighth wonder of the world, if you increase your returns by 15% every year, which is what you're doing by contributing to superannuation and enjoying that compounding over a period of time, it kind of makes sense that you pay the piper one day, you know, because you've had such a good time along the way while you're alive, provided you snuck under the transfer balance cap, you've lived tax-free. Some people live quite comfortably in retirement for 20 or 30 years, Ben, and basically pay no tax. So the concept that there would be an amount to pay on the wealth that comes out of your superannuation, I think is fair enough, but it's just more about understanding that A, it exists, and B, it's a possible low-hanging fruit to be tweaked in, say, the next 5 to 10 years.
And the other one is principal place of residence, people's homes. I can see that as being I think I mentioned it before, but a really big pot of gold as people transition, pass away and transfer to the next generation. Is at the moment there's no capital gains tax. There's no tax on that when you actually sell it or when you die if it's your principal place of residence. So I can see that being being a potential pool as well, and a very large pool. However, I think that may be less palatable politically than it would be superannuation.
Yeah, because we're all so used to it. And, the great Australian dream is to own a home. Part of that is because your principal place of residence taxation exemption is so attractive, and the capital growth of Australian property in the last 20 to 30 years has been fairly consistent. We've sort of doubled every decade, give or take. But our capital gains tax on your home, and even on an investment property with a 50% individual discount, if you hold it for more than 12 months, is very, very generous when you look at other OECD country taxation regimes in the world. Australia is a very, very generous one in terms of that, which is part of why Australians love property, because you've got a 100% discount on your home and a 50% discount on an investment property that you've held for more than 12 months. So again, go back almost 4 years, the Labor government ran on a mandate to tweak the capital gains tax, get rid of the 50% exemption, or maybe look at thresholds. Politically, it was very unpopular, but that's not to say that won't be touched or attacked in the future, because it is a very generous system.
Yeah, and as you said before, there's an economic environment or a geopolitical environment where it becomes palatable to do the tough or make the tough decisions. So, obviously this is all theoretical in the sense that we don't have death taxes, as we're saying. We're saying it's politically unpopular and we may not see it come in, but there is the risk of it happening is increasing. So what are some of the things we can do to protect our family's wealth if this sort of thing should happen to come in?
Well, educate and keep your ear to the ground, Ben. This productivity report that came in November last year was accompanied by some sort of survey. I don't truly understand what the survey was or who the cohort was, but apparently, and remember we've talked about 98% of statistics are made up, Ben, but there was a large proportion of the survey participants who said they were open-minded and understanding of a reintroduction of a death tax. And there was a real outcry about that, because pretty much everyone you saw who had responded to those series of articles said, who on earth did they ask? Because I'm not one of them and I don't know anyone else who would be supportive of a death tax. So keep your ear to the ground and understand things, not only the existing taxation environment and the de facto death taxes we've talked about, capital gains tax, foreign beneficiaries, 15 to 17% in superannuation, they are de facto death taxes. So anytime there's some discussion or some investigation on messing with them, sit up straight and pay attention, Ben, because that could be a death tax by another name. And if there's no resistance to it, it might just come in and then we get stuck with it for 300 years or something along those lines. But of course, we always say this is get good advice. There are good ways to manage succession while you're alive. You don't have to write a will that says I give everything away upon my death. We've always got the risk of retrospective taxes coming in and saying, well, Ben, you inherited the family farm 3 years ago and I'm going to go back at least 5 years of every gift transaction that's happened in that time frame. But, like I said to you, the examples of those families who are doing it now out of, I guess, a bit of fear or a bit of anxiety that something will come in the future is get organised, I suppose, and definitely keep your ear to the ground.
I think that's wise words. I mean, I look at the tax regime at the moment. If you actually do your tax planning and get good advice, you can really manage that tax liability or tax problem over time. If you leave it and just ignore it, the consequences are far worse than if you'd done something about it. So I always say keep your intergenerational wealth advisors close. So speaking to your accountant about, well, how does the current tax regime tax us if I was to pass away? And a couple of little traps I've seen over the years is farm management deposits. Is what people don't understand is they have all this money tied up in farm management deposits. And if you die, that farm management deposit, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Tim, you're the tax expert, farm management deposits then actually get bought back in to the situation as income.
Yeah, that's correct, Ben, because the eligibility for a farm management deposit, an FMD, means you have to have primary production status. So as a general rule, dead people can't have primary production status. Your estate can maintain its status for 2 to 3 years. So there is a planning opportunity there. But in essence, at some stage, if you haven't planned for that and got good advice based on that, all of that farm management deposit come back into your estate and be taxed. And again, that's a real problem.
Yeah, and also with superannuation, you talked about the non-beneficiaries tax, that 15 to 17%. That's one that you can actually manage over time if you've got enough time. And so talking with your professional advisors well in advance to know what you're potentially liable for, and then also what you can do, because it sometimes takes time. I mean, to unwind these things or prepare for these things to minimise your liabilities can take 5, 10, 15 years, especially around capital gains tax and those sorts of things. So I think that's really important. And the last point I had was, if we see this, we need our associations, etc., to lobby our politicians to make sure that farming assets don't fall within this regime, because I think you will unequivocally see, if it's not done right, farming families have to sell the farm because they can't afford the tax. So it's really important to lobby those politicians and make sure they clearly understand the unintended consequences of these sorts of legislations.
Yeah, definitely, Ben. And, with any problem, there's a potential solution. So couple of things we've mentioned here today, the foreign beneficiaries, for example, when your kids go overseas and never come back, implementing a testamentary discretionary trust under your will can resolve that. Okay, so you delay the distribution of the assets to that foreign beneficiary for a period of time to do that planning over, say, 3 to 5 years, even after your death. So there's a great planning opportunity to do that. The taxation on superannuation, there's a recontribution scheme we can do, so we can at least wash through 300,000. But that takes 3 years to implement, Ben. So don't leave it too late. There are age rules around that recontribution scheme. So, go get that advice, ask the questions, and listen to these podcasts so you know what the issues are, and then go see your advisor and ask the right questions.
I think that's really, really important advice. So, Tim, well, I think that was fantastic, mate. I think you've got a great tax knowledge. I think it's a topic that is going to come up more and more around the barbecue, especially in the farming world. I think professional advisors are going to be watching it closely, and politicians are going to be very sensitive to trying to find money and what the reactions will be. So the more noise the community can make around the unintended consequences, I think the better off we'll be, and try and steer them away from potentially having those major impacts.
Yeah, information is power, Ben. So keep your ear to the ground and make some noise when you hear something you don't like the sound of.
Yeah, perfect. Excellent. Well, look, thanks very much for your time today, Tim. That was great. Look forward to the next one.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
I just want to sum up a couple of key points. The first one, there are currently death taxes in Australia that may affect you. So go get advice from your accountant, lawyer, or financial advisor, consider their impact, and then look at if there's ways to plan around that. And secondly, if you're involved in any industry associations, make sure you share this episode with your committee and general members, because if death taxes are seriously considered by politicians, our industry association should be heavily lobbying the government about the potentially severe impacts on business as a whole, and especially the rural industry. Now, if you're enjoying the podcast and serious about building your wealth, consider joining our private Facebook group, The Financial Blokes Wealth and Wisdom. And I'd love it if you'd help a bloke out and share the podcast with your family and friends. Subscribe or follow the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. And reviews are an exceptional way for us to get the message out, because places like Apple Podcasts and Spotify also help more people find the podcast if we get your 5-star reviews. And finally, we have to keep the lawyers happy. The information contained in this podcast is general in nature and for educational purposes only. It's not financial advice and it's not legal advice. You shouldn't act on the information without appropriate specific advice for your particular circumstances. I'm a former financial advisor but choose to no longer be licensed and cannot and will not give you specific or personal advice in this podcast. So that's all for me today. Thanks for investing your time again, and I'll see you in 2 weeks' time.